Excellent. Well, thank you very much for being here. As most of you know, I'm Jerry Warburg with the Batten School, and we're delighted. It's a real honor to have the majority leader here. And it's a tribute to you, sir, that on a football and basketball Friday, with the sun out on the lawn, we've got a full house. Before I welcome our distinguished guest, I'd like to just go over the format just for a moment so you guys know how we're going to proceed. We're going to forego a prepared lecture today, and there are going to be no talking points. We're going to get right to Q&A, and Mr. Cantor has generously agreed to take questions from any and all and get right into the substance of some of the issues we'd like to talk about. Primarily about the 2016 campaign and the agenda for economic growth, but also about leadership and many of the other issues we've had the opportunity to discuss this morning. This is a classroom. This is a learning session. I'm going to call on students for questions. I know there's working press in the room. We will have a press availability afterwards. But I just ask you as a courtesy to our guests to please identify yourself and where you are in the Batten School or elsewhere, and perhaps your hometown. I think that's always helpful to know where you're coming from, in case you're former constituents. With the nation honoring our veterans this week, I took a moment to call my 91-year-old dad to thank him for his service. He was a skinny teenage Army intelligence officer interrogating Nazis during World War II, an interesting challenge for a college sophomore. But when I thought about the service of veterans, I thought also about today's guest, and I thought about the gratitude we feel towards those who engage in the public policy arena, in which has become a very public form of combat as well. And we certainly have a veteran of that world with us here today. I know personally that barreling up I-95 from Richmond at 6:30 a.m. every day is no picnic, and managing divisions within faction-riddled parties and between faction-riven parties has become such a contact sport that I really feel we ought to honor some of our political veterans on Veterans Day as well. Eric Cantor rose from very modest Virginia roots to be elected by his peers to one of the most powerful posts in the country, majority leader. And that speaks volumes about our nation, about our common values, and about what we as a nation, virtually all of immigrants, can accomplish working together. Think about it for just a minute. We've got 300 million citizens. We send 538 people to Washington to represent us. Those 538 people, the majority of them chose Mr. Cantor to be their majority leader in the people's body in the House of Representatives. He was charged with dealing with the minority. He was charged with dealing with the president and his cabinet of another party. And he was charged with dealing what we veterans of the Hill know is the real enemy, the United States Senate, where bills go to die. More than most in our public life, Mr. Cantor got to enjoy extraordinary and very substantial victories, major accomplishments, and because this is politics, an occasional public disappointment. Mr. Cantor performed his service with grace, with dignity, and with humility. He articulated a clear vision of how he saw our nation's best interests secured, and he's worked with, when appropriate, with political adversaries in the White House to pursue consensus solutions when our national challenges demanded it. I also have it on good authority, and please keep this in this room because we don't want to cloud anyone's political future, that he developed some very good professional and personal friendships working across the aisle with some Democrats, including our old friend who we both work with, the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden. Don't tell anybody. I don't want to get you in trouble. He also had the wisdom to encourage his sons to pursue a UVA education, and with the forthcoming graduation of one of my top students, a Batten School degree. Mr. Cantor is now deep into the private sector challenges, leading a major Wall Street public investment firm, and explaining the opportunities and the dysfunction of Washington to his clients. He has more than a passing interest in the 2016 elections and is advising the campaign of Governor Jeb Bush as he weathers that campaign, that challenging campaign. We've asked him today to visit with us on the issues in the 2016 campaigns, particularly the economic growth agenda, where he has been such a thought leader throughout his career, and we'll also be eager to have his take on what I confess has become must-watch TV, not just for Republicans, the irresistible and far more interesting Republican Party presidential debates. Finally, what we hope for most today is insight and wisdom. Insight to guide our students, future leaders all on how we can better work together to find wise solutions for our country. So please join me in welcoming back to grounds a distinguished national thought leader and a Batten School parent, Mr. Eric Cantor. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here.
It really is great to be here, and I just want to say thanks for having me back. And also, what a tremendous jewel the Batten School is. Obviously, all of you have to be of stellar academic prowess to even be at UVA. And then also, those of you who are Batten School students, just hats off, because public service has not always been easy, but I can tell you from experience, tremendously rewarding, and we need you involved for the future of our country. So it's just great to be here.
I'm going to get the questions started. It's the wonderful prerogative of the chair and the host. And then I'm going to look very soon to you guys to get the opportunity to pose some questions directly to the leader. We talked about open rules and policy riders on CRs. So those of you in my congressional strategy class, you can pick up right where I left off in talking about some of the challenges before Speaker Ryan. But I wanted to explore just a couple of general pieces of the terrain before we get into the weeds. It strikes me, Mr. Leader, that you were tasked repeatedly with negotiating with the President and his team and trying to reach some grand bargains on taxes and spending and the growth agenda. We talk in our class a lot about some of the issues where we might have a clear emerging consensus. You see, for example, criminal justice reform is where some of the libertarian folks and some of the conservatives and some of the progressives might actually be able to cut a deal on criminal justice reform. But could you sketch out for us a few of the areas where you think our nation is ripe for having some bipartisan agreements going forward?
Sure, and hopefully we can get into a discussion of dissecting why bipartisanship has been so difficult over the last 7 years, and probably even prior to that. But I do think that there are some areas that perhaps don't begin with a partisan tint, and there is some room to run. Criminal justice reform is a great example. There is also, we were downstairs and the Professor Warburg just pointed out the Center for Social Entrepreneurship. And, I mentioned I was just at the headquarters of WeWorks in New York this past weekend on a panel. And, doing good but lending free market entrepreneurial sort of concepts and practices to that is a marrying up, really, if you will, of two worlds, and one that gives both sides, if you will, a win. And I think that's where bipartisanship could really work. I can tell you out of experience, there was one real bipartisan victory. It wasn't just we were pushed into some kind of finished result, but it was in something called the Jobs Act. And this was about 3 years ago almost. The Jobs Act was passed. It was an acronym for Jumpstart Our Business Startups Act. In Washington, and I don't know if there is an hour session on how you name bills, but believe me, that's the ultimate.
We'll add it to the curriculum, sir.
In creativity, and honestly, being in the private sector, when you got to name a company, it's sad to say that that's often the hardest part too. So naming a bill is often difficult, but it's fun. But this bill brought together both sides, and it was premised on the fact that America, unfortunately, has seen a downward trend in the number of business startups, and in fact, the number of business startups is lower than that which marks business demise. So shutting down of businesses, there's more of those than startups right now, which is so anathema to what most of us think about America. So this bill brought together both sides and said, listen, let's set aside what you think about wealth disparity or upward mobility and how to get there. We all can agree that business, startups, entrepreneurialism, being a startup nation is something that both sides agree with. And so it was signed at the White House. The consumer groups got very engaged at the last minute because they were a little bit fearful that allowing for, and a big part of this bill was allowing for online funding, crowdfunding through digital application, and lowering the sort of hurdles for somebody to go public in their business to access equity investors. Anyway, it was a great success. The SEC actually just announced finalization of some rulemaking there, so it will, I believe, increase in its impact in the capital markets. So again, an example where you can pick something that doesn't necessarily start from a partisan sort of tent that we can all unify around. The other are sort of regional sort of issues, issues that really have no partisan tint to them, although more and more difficult to find these days.
I've got to ask you a second question because I'm mystified by something perhaps you can help me explain. When I look at the Republican lineup for this year, I see veteran governors with a very established track record and distinguished pedigree and different political philosophies, whether it's a Christie or Governor Jeb Bush, but substantial experience making public policy decisions. I see some of the senators who are very articulate spokespersons. And I look at the Democratic bench, and it seems terribly thin. And when your fresh new face is our friend Joe Biden, you got to be a little worried about your party's future. And yet, I pick up this morning's Washington Post and the screamer headline, GOP leaders pushing panic button. Or I hear the Sturm und Drang about the future of the Republican Party. David Brooks today in the New York Times about crossroads for Republicans on immigration, which I think we've seen that headline about 25 times before. Why is there so much gnashing of teeth that there's a full, vibrant discussion on the Republican side with a lot of men and women from different backgrounds, different levels of experience? Isn't that a good thing?
Well, I love your comment about David Brooks in the headline, because the headlines really can get to you after a while if you're in office or out of office, and it does breed some cynicism again. But yeah, I think it's a good thing. I think it's a good thing to have a robust field. It's clearly been a good thing for the media outlets and the television companies, right, the communications companies, because as you've seen, the viewership of these Republican debates has been enormous. I think the Fox Business debate the other night was maybe close to 13 million viewers. The CNBC debate was 20 million. The largest viewership the CNBC has ever had. And I would venture to guess that probably Fox Business this week also could register a high mark for that network. So it has been good for them. And as you say, Professor, it's been entertaining. I mean, it really is almost entertainment. Donald Trump, I mean, you know, he's a reality TV show star. And he uses that skill in these so-called debates. You know, when he looks down the line and makes an offhand comment about Carly Fiorina, or he decides he wants to go after John Kasich and just pops him one about oil being struck in Ohio with having zero to do with the question. But, you know, hey, so there is a certain amount of that. And again, you know, and maybe y'all in your generation don't realize that we are in a very different sort of world when it comes to communications now. It is 24/7. It is instantaneous. And the world of Twitter and social network is really changed the entertainment value of things, the nature of entertainment. So yes, it is good though. With all that, it's still good to have so many voices that want to participate. And to your comment earlier, Professor, about the nature of our country, that we can do this in such a robust fashion and people are so fascinated by it. I think when you look at the Republican side, the reason I believe that so many people are there has a little bit to do with access to funding, but even less of that now because it has to do with access to media. You know, it's so democratized now. Everyone is empowered for good and bad. So, and I also think on my side of the aisle, there is a lot of pent-up anger and people who really feel that they can do something about it and do something differently. On the Democratic side of the aisle, it's interesting. There's been, whenever you have a president in office, there is almost some discipline that comes from having the president down through the party ranks. That discipline has been there by President Obama up until now, and certainly beginning to fray as he is in a serious lame duck status. And so the forces within the party are now beginning to speak out, and I think manifesting itself certainly in Bernie Sanders. You know, there not being an incumbent vice president running, I would imagine Hillary Clinton the next best thing to that for the Democrats. But the out party clearly has more of the fire because they've been out for so many years. And again, the anger, you know, we can talk a little bit about where that comes from, but certainly adding to the robust nature of the debate.
Fascinating. I promised to open up the floor very early on. I want to be a man of my word. I'm going to ask for hands. We've got a mic here. And again, just as a courtesy to our guests, if you tell them your hometown and where you are in the school and your name, and give us a question. Here we go. This is easy. This is TJ Mason.
How you doing?
Student body president.
I got an introduction. Mr. Cantor, first off, thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Terry Mason. I'm actually from New Kent, Virginia. I'm a second-year Master's Public Policy student here. So in regards to Republican outreach to Hispanic and Latino voters, so currently you have, I guess, two trains of thoughts in the Republican field right now, which is like Donald Trump, who says, you know, we're going to put all 11.3 million people back in South and Central America, build a wall, it's going to be huge. And also you have people like, I think, more grounded in reality, Jeb Bush, John Kasich, who are like, you can't break up families, these people are here, they're here to stay. I think the concerns that lots of Donald Trump voters, you know, they're very animated. It's two things. I think one's economics, one is the tightening of the labor market, the driving down of wages for everyone, and also anti-immigrant sentiment. I think that's undeniable. And so in regards to, I guess, two things. I don't think Donald Trump will be the nominee. So then the actual potential nominee, which will be, I think, maybe a Jeb Bush, will have to pick up the pieces and repair that relationship with Latinos. How do they go about doing that? And furthermore, how do they then bring along those former Trump voters who were so animated by that rhetoric that he was espousing?
So that's a great question. There's a lot in there. Let me speak generally about immigration, its sort of role in the presidential election, writ large, like how, in the context of the other issues there, and then perhaps my sense on how to go forward with a Jeb Bush nominee. So the first thing, you know, the issue of immigration as a whole, remember, you know, I start from the standpoint that we are a country of immigrants. As Professor Warburg indicated in the introduction of me, you know, I am a second-generation American, my father being and mother being first. Their parents, my grandparents, were immigrants. And so many can tell that story of grandparents coming, in my case, from Eastern Europe. They were, my grandparents, subjected to religious persecution. I'm Jewish, so they were under the, you know, the heavy boot of the czars of Russia and the so-called pogroms that went on against the Jews, and were some of the lucky ones to get out and to make it here. And without that, I wouldn't be sitting here today. So we are that, and it does provide a distinction of America to the rest of the world, and especially our allies in Western Europe, because everyone here came from somewhere, and most came because they chose to be here and were lucky enough to get here. The country didn't always get it right because some were forced to come here, and we're still working on that. But we are also, in these modern times, an attractive place to emigrate to because we're a country of laws. And it's the certainty of our law and the protection of equal opportunity and equal rights that does provide a very unique place for us and the blessing that we enjoy being Americans. So the immigration issue is about balancing those two. How can we do both? And you know, so when you hear a Donald Trump, you know, just rant about his wall and the magnificent wall that he's going to build and all that, you know, if you look at the polls in the Republican electorate, most Republicans are willing to say, yes, we should do something to reform the immigration system, and we can't expect that the 11 or 12 million who are here illegally are going to be deported. Most Republicans, by far, will accept that notion. But it is a smaller subset that is in the extreme that may, in fact, respond to some of Mr. Trump's words. I've said they're very ugly at times, very divisive. And you rightfully suggest that is not a way to go about winning a general election. It certainly doesn't reflect my views or those who I hope are most of the candidates there. And it was interesting last night, Donald Trump apparently had a 90-minute rant in Iowa, or I think he was in Iowa, and the news commentators say that the crowd wasn't as moved, perhaps, as Mr. Trump wanted on the issue of immigration. So your question of how do you go from where a Donald Trump is to hopefully where a Jeb Bush nominee is in terms of appealing to the minority community, the immigrant community, and frankly, your generation that is much more inclined to embrace a reform. And I believe that in our country, we have always been a much more optimistic lot. And we've always been and should continue to be a people of tolerance. And, yes, there is an economic tinge to this discussion about immigrants because some will play the notion that there's a fixed-sum game, a zero-sum game, that if you allow more people in, you're going to crowd American jobs out. I don't believe in that. I believe that we are and can continue to be upward in terms of job creation. There have been a couple 100,000 almost jobs created over this year per month. We can continue to do that and grow jobs for all. And I believe that. And that is going to take a candidate that can convey that in economic terms. But I also go back and say this about how you appeal to more diverse communities. Remember, we're a country of immigrants, but lately those immigrants have been attracted to America because of opportunity. Our opportunity does come from the equal application of the law. And I always talk about this sort of story that a sheriff told me one time. If you are somewhere out in the mountain west of the U.S. and you're driving a car and there isn't anyone around for 50 miles, and you come to a stop sign in an intersection, nobody around, most Americans are going to stop at that stop sign. It's the fabric and the nature of who we are, law-abiding people for the most part. So that, again, demonstrating your commitment, respect of the law, at the same time forging a solution so that we can be that America that invites opportunity, upward mobility for all. And I think that's sort of the recipe for a candidate coming out of a Republican primary.
Josh, you're on. I see a question right here next to TJ.
Hi. First of all, thank you for coming. I'm Zakir. I'm from Houston, Texas, and I'm a first year at UVA. And I guess my question for you is that a lot of times when we think about politics, when you look into what people in Congress are doing, there's always a medium there. There's the news sources and whatnot. There's always some barrier. And so my question to you is, what is it like a day in the life in Congress?
Okay, I didn't understand the question.
What is it like a day in the life of a member of Congress in terms of particularly questions that come at you out of the blue when you've been talking about another subject? Is that a fair inference?
Yeah.
I didn't understand the wall. You said the barrier?
Like there's always some sort of barrier between people in Congress and American people. Like there's the news, there's no like direct communication like we have today. So thank you for coming.
Okay, I got you. So what is it like as a member of Congress? Well, first of all, being a member of Congress and then being in leadership in Congress is a difference there because you have two constituencies. And I can recall most the last 6 years I was there until last year in leadership. And you remember, you've got close to 40,000 constituents. And my being from Richmond in the 7th District, in close proximity to Washington, I could usually expect classes, constituents to be in D.C. on a somewhat regular basis. And so you had that obligation to make sure you were there for them. But also, as majority leader, I was also elected with, at the time, there was 237 other members who elected me their majority leader that I had to sort of tend to. So there's sort of that dual role. But in the, in the general sense of being a member of Congress, you want to try and always be there for the people at home. And again, when you become sort of an incumbent that's associated with Washington, the quick hit in the political terms on you is you've gone to Washington. It's certainly an allegation that was thrown at me a lot, especially when I became majority leader, that, oh, he can never understand who we are because he's part of that now. And that being very toxic at this point. We're seeing it in the play out in the primaries. But you know, the day is much about being scheduled every 15 minutes and having difficulty actually pursuing and completing a thought. Because you do have to, especially as leader, you have to be a real generalist, and you've got to be willing to shift from whether it's a healthcare issue or all of a sudden you're talking about Mr. Putin in Russia, to talking about nuclear waste issues here at home, to talking about hurricane damage in the district. I mean, you are constantly churning, and if you are in any way intellectually curious, the job can sometimes be frustrating, but it's an unbelievable job. Frustrating because you're not allowed to pursue that curiosity for very long because you'll be late for your next meeting. Or, though, in a way, tremendous sort of perspective because you do and can meet with people who've done some amazing things and can provide some insight into some curiosity that you may have in a specific arena. So again, that's why I started by saying, great that you're here, that you're students at Batten, an honorable pursuit, despite what the press says, being a public servant.
Thank you. We got more questions here. I might add a comment there. One of the things that astonished me when I first worked for the majority whip in the Senate was that when I would place a call to, say, the Batten School, the dean would call me back and offer to bring a panel of the nation's experts on any problem I had. And I was, a 22-year-old punk just calling up from the LA's desk. But it's extraordinary the amount of information that flows into members of Congress to help them shape a decision, not just from lobbyists, but from public servants who want to provide information. It's a fire hose. Thanks, Josh.
Hi, I'm a
Can't see you. Can you stand up? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure.
There you are.
I'm Riley. I'm a third-year politics major from Northern Virginia, and I was wondering how your anti-affirmative action stance will affect the racial conflicts across campuses in the nation, and how we can further represent students from diverse backgrounds without affirmative action.
I guess you may look at some vote where you would say I was anti-affirmative action, not necessarily describing who I am, because I've always believed that the beauty of our country is freedom. And right, you are free to be who you are, I believe, 85% of the time, and that remaining 15%, you better be tolerant of others. And part of that tolerance means respecting that each and every one of us have a right to climb the ladder. And that is the American ladder of success. And that's been part of what's, I think, brewing as the public policy challenge of our time. Is some would say, I think more on the left, it's about wealth disparity, income disparity. I like to say it's more about the inequality of opportunity, and that is that opportunity gap. Is how do we ensure not necessarily that you're taking from those who've been successful and redistributing it to those who haven't, because I don't think that's a sustainable fix. The sustainable fix is how do you make sure those at the top, instead of giving a hand out, give a hand up? How do you make sure those at the top say to those who can't even get on the first rung of the ladder, here are some tools that you need to begin to climb? And that is, I think, underneath your question, because if you believe affirmative action is necessary to afford those who otherwise couldn't be at UVA or couldn't necessarily go to the best schools, if you believe that, then you would say the reason for any kind of policy like that is to afford equal opportunity. And again, you say, I am very much about equal opportunity. not necessarily equal outcomes. You know, you think about it. You know, we're not a country of equal outcomes, and that's a lot of the debate today. You know, a lot of the fire, if you see like an Elizabeth Warren, who is constantly in the news talking about maligning those who've been successful in whatever industry is the target of the day, whether it's Wall Street or this big energy company or that big company, and all of a sudden they're big, so they're bad. They're successful, they're bad. We've gotten shafted, so the thinking goes, just because somebody else has gotten ahead. No. We believe in success in America. We believe in competition, but we believe in an even playing field. And I think that's where, you know, sort of the challenge of our time is, how do you ensure an even playing field to afford equal opportunity, and not necessarily then say, just because somebody is done better than I had, that it's unfair. No, nobody says that everyone can be the same. We don't want that in America. We want everyone to have the same opportunity.
More questions? I see a lot of hands. How about let's go here, and then let's go up front here to you next. A hand right next to Josh. And then we'll go up here, and I'll come back around on this side and get you guys.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm Nora. I'm a fourth-year foreign affairs major, and
Where are you from?
I'm from Kuwait originally. So I was wondering, how do you feel about the GOP's sensationalist narrative on Muslims in America, especially since you are a religious minority?
There should not be any sensational position about Muslims in America. And I know that there have been some candidates like Ben Carson and others who've made some comments that probably have been perceived that way. You know, obviously, as you point out, as a religious minority, that's the beauty of our country, is we need to respect everyone's right to practice their own religion. And I've often said that one of the sort of impactful experiences I had as a publicly elected official is my first year, a couple years in the Virginia General Assembly. I was near the back of the chamber, on the side in the House of Delegates. How many have been in the House of Delegates chamber in Richmond? Oh, that's up to you. There is etched in granite Thomas Jefferson's Statute of Religious Freedom, as we know, part of his epitaph at Monticello. And as someone who's a religious minority in America, I mean, that means everything. You know, it does set us apart. And I think it does also help shape who we are economically, and help shape who the country is as a world power. And obviously, I have a lot of issues about the current direction that we're heading as a world power. But I'm very much in opposition to anyone who says that a Muslim couldn't be and isn't a full and participating member as a U.S. citizen of our country.
Let me throw in one in the middle here, because I was thinking about the campaign, and I was thinking about all the jobs people are going to ask you to do if you guys are fortunate enough to succeed in 2016. Let's just posit for a moment that the Republicans won the White House. I suspect many of us believe they'll hold the House until 2023 at least. We get some new districts, maybe there's a fighting chance for the Ds, and they'll hold the Senate. And you're in there advising President Bush, and you've just completed your first year as Treasury Secretary. Sorry, I'm giving you more work.
For the record, that is not what we're after here.
But you've been successful. Your economic plans from Washington have been successful, and you've realized a vision with the unique opportunity of Republican House, Republican Senate, Republican White House. And the country's economy is booming because of your policies. What is it that you've done that was critical to success to grow our economy the way all Americans want it grown? What are the key elements of a successful strategy there?
You know, if you saw, how many saw the Fox News debate the other night? Fox Business debate. Okay, so most. You
guys should have been doing your homework.
The beauty is you can always go back and see it. You know, I mean, you don't, just the scheduling can be your own. So, Jeb Bush, in one of his initial answers to a question, talked about the need for regulatory reform, because I think the question was, what would you do? And the reason why I think the regulatory reform issue is so important goes back to the point that it's very, very difficult right now to even be an entrepreneur in this country. And the numbers bear that out. Taking the risk of signing your name or to a loan from somebody, taking the risk that you won't have income next month because you want to plow it into a business to chase your dreams and create jobs and create value, frankly, right now has not been on the rise. That is fundamental to what I believe America is about. So if we are in a situation where you see a Republican president in 2017 or 18 having now accomplished some success, what would that be? I do think it is sort of injecting more balance into the regulatory arena and say, how do we make it so that people your age and otherwise are more inclined to want to go out there and be a startup? Because those are the places, those businesses, the young startup businesses, yes, they start and fail a lot, but they are where the job generation really occurs disproportionately. And the Kauffman Foundation that is dedicated to entrepreneurialism in this country has got some great work. It's done some great research on this about entrepreneurialism, where the jobs come from, but it's from the young startups. And they get started, and then they close, and they get started. But the problem is it's starting them right now that's hurting. So I think that that would be a big part of it. Certainly there's a lot of discussion about tax reform. And that comes really much more, certainly from working family standpoint, having to deal with a tax code, yay long and complicated to comply with. But it also has to do with the multinational corporations that are here in the U.S. and having to compete abroad. And that gets very, very political. And right now, part of the reason why you're not seeing any movement on the corporate tax reform and especially international corporate tax reform is because of the politics. Because unfortunately, it's become a very binary situation that if you want to help American-based multinationals compete abroad, you are accused in the political arena of offshoring jobs. Because if you're going to lower tax burden for companies that operate internationally, all of a sudden you're accused of saying, hey, you're helping them put more jobs over in Europe or Asia. I can tell you in my current position, as Vice Chairman of Moelis & Company, and we're an investment bank and deal with a lot of cross-border transactions, we have clients in Europe and elsewhere who just cannot believe that America can't get its act together. Because what they see is, they see companies in their countries, in the EU, in the UK and elsewhere, that are looking at American targets saying, my goodness, we can come in and pay a premium because our burden of taxation is that much lower. So what are you Americans thinking? You can't just rest on your laurels and say, just because you're America, you don't have to compete. So I do think that tax reform is another aspect of it. But it goes back to, I think, one of the questions about equal opportunity, too. People in this country, I think, in order to start to take risk again, they got to feel they have a fair shot. And that has to come from leader at the top in the White House.
Thank you. I promised the young lady here, and then I'm going to go back in that corner. Thank you.
I'm Dominique. I'm a fourth-year Foreign Affairs major from the Netherlands, actually, so not from here. But I'm really curious about your insights as to why candidates with little political experience, besides Trump, such as Ben Carson and Carly Fiorina, are appealing to so many people right now, and what kind of it says about Washington that people think it's a good thing to not have experience, in a sense, in politics, which just to me, as an international student, is very
crazy,
confusing.
So first of all, I would say a lot of it does have to do with the economic situation in the country for working middle-class Americans, and I'm talking wage earners. And wages have not gone up for working middle-class families. The W-2 income wages have not gone up, if you take into consideration inflation, for decades. Disposable income. And so if you have that going on and the added cost of college education, of health care, of retirement, whatever it is, you can see why people would be upset. And naturally, they look to Washington to try and fix the problem, and it hasn't been fixed after promises and promises and promises, cycle after cycle in the elections. So I think that's first and foremost. On the Republican side of the aisle, my sense is that there's been an expectations game that has come into play. And there is, because of that, some disappointment in the so-called establishment in Washington. And having been in leadership in Washington and a victim of some of that, I think it's very real. Because if you see how the Republicans were vaulted into the majority in 2010, that was, in my opinion, response to Obama's election, extraordinary historical event, and almost supermajorities in both houses, and the ability for the administration to go and pursue an agenda that was frankly done so in mostly partisan fashion. And I'm talking about the stimulus, I'm talking about the health care law, Dodd-Frank, regulatory push, not a lot of bipartisanship there. And there was a real pushback with the rise up of the Tea Party and the rest in 2010. So the expectation when Republicans took control was, hey, you just need to go in there and block this, stop this overreach that we see. And that expectation was quickly fulfilled because if the president wanted to get something through, he had to work with the Republican-controlled House. But somewhere along the line, over the next couple years, the expectation shifted from being the sort of check and balance in the block to saying, hey, wait a minute, you're in control now. You need to be enacting an agenda that reflects our vision of a limited government, of tax reform, of repealing Obamacare, all that. Well, you can't do that. If you have President Obama in office, you can't expect him to repeal his own health care bill. Well, the expectation was you said that you were there. And then you don't have 2/3 in the House, in the Senate, so you can't override vetoes, or in the House. So, it's this expectations game. So I do think these outsiders then can rile up the whole populace and say, you know what, yeah, this is terrible for you. But don't blame me. I didn't have anything to do with not showing up and not being on the job to do the kinds of things you want. And then the irony is these outsiders, some of them, look at Trump, he's promising this wall. He's promising this wall and paid for by the government in Mexico City. Talking about promises that will not be fulfilled, the ultimate irony in somebody who claims to be an outsider that wouldn't engage in the same game. But I do think that expectations game has a lot to do with why outsiders right now are so noticeable in the polls. I, however, do think as we get closer to the first ballot being cast, that you're going to see a seriousness set in, that people are going to stop to think, hey, wait a minute, we're actually electing somebody to sit in the Oval Office. We're actually electing somebody to care for this country and lead. And things that are going on the ground in the early states are much more reflective of that than these national polls and the national sort of perception that's coming through the media all the time.
I've got to ask a quick follow-up on that because we had a fascinating conversation that I wish all the students in my Congress class could have heard about the challenges for Speaker Ryan, and I'm going to try to see if I can get you to reprise a little bit of that. And just to set the scene, some of the young leaders, the young guns, Mr. McCarthy, Mr. Ryan, Mr. Cantor, played a really critical role in driving forward the Republican majority in some historic elections, yet managing expectations, precisely as you said, sir. Now your good friend Paul Ryan, someone who, even those of us who work on the other side of the aisle, have enormous respect for his capacity and his patriotism, he's raised enormous expectations. Open rules, they're going to vote on all the appropriations bills before the holidays. All these wonderful things are going to happen, and the lion's going to lie down with the lamb. I think the question my students in Congress 101 would want to ask is how's that going to work out for them?
Well, again, I mean, I think Paul will be on 60 Minutes this Sunday. I saw a little clip as I was getting ready this morning on TV, and he will say that he's committed to doing the bold things that Republicans believe we were sent to Washington to do. I think that's what you'll probably hear him say. And it was much akin to the kind of agenda that he was pursuing as chairman of the Ways and Means Committee when I was majority leader, and trying to work with him to affect tax reform, entitlement reform, welfare reform. These are big, big challenges for our country, but actually something that does take bipartisan participation, because every one of those things, just like health care, affects everyone. Everyone is going to be affected by tax reform. Everyone's going to be affected by entitlement reform, Medicare, Social Security reform. Everyone will be affected by these things, so you need participation. The problem has been, and the dynamic that has set in hasn't changed, and that is, going back to when President Obama was first elected, he went and affected huge change in almost a unilateral sense. Because he was able to do so. He had the votes to do it before the Scott Brown election, after Senator Kennedy passed away, and it sort of stopped it a little bit in the Senate, and then came the majority in the House. But in the meantime, though, they were able to affect very big change with Dodd-Frank and Obamacare especially, the ACA. So the narrative that's played out since then has basically been the White House has dug in and said, we're going to protect what we accomplished, and my side has said all we're going to do is try and tear it down without having the votes to do so. And so bipartisanship and cooperation and compromise has really become non-existent in most cases. And so that dynamic hasn't changed. I think it will change come a new president, because I don't think, even though I believe you're right, Professor, there'll be a Republican president. You didn't say that, I'm saying it. But that...
it's a Halloween vision
right,
for some of my liberal friends here.
That there'll be a President Jeb Bush with a Republican Congress, but I don't think it'll be supermajorities like Barack Obama had. So there'll have to be negotiations. There'll have to be forging solutions and cooperation and compromise, or you'll get nothing done. Paul, I think, wants to go forward and try and set the table, if you will, from a policy standpoint. So we'll have to see if all that comes to the floor. We were talking, Professor, about sort of leadership and politics versus the private sector. And one of the things in politics is, as a leader, you have to pay recognition to almost like an outside force that affects the people that you work with, and that's the political arena, that's the advocacy groups, it's the press, and where do you appeal to that to help you further your agenda? So if you want to affect tax reform, instead of saying, well, we're just going to do it, I believe you owe it to the public, because then these forces can come to work and help, because you owe it to them to say where the problems are. Well, the problems have been that there's disagreement when it comes to international tax reform on the worldwide tax rate, if there's going to be one, on the extent of territoriality. Where is the disagreement when it comes to individual tax reform and pass-through and small business tax reform? Spell it out so that the folks in Washington, whether it be the business community and advocacy and lobbying groups or the consumer groups, they can engage into the debate. So again, I think it comes down to communication, really. Leaders need to communicate where the issues are, the problems are, and help be constructive to allow more people to play a part in forging a solution from the outside.
Thank you. I'm going to suggest maybe 2 more questions, and then we'll let you come up and engage individually with our guest. Josh, I see a question. Gentleman in the back here has been trying to get recognition for a while. And sir, I'm going to go to you next.
Hi, my name is Connor Maxwell. I'm a first-year MPP student, and I'm from Washington, D.C. Based on conversations I've had with many of my friends and classmates, the Republicans' economic message is far more palatable to my generation than their social message. Do you think that the Republican Party needs to change its stance on social issues in order to win more support from my generation?
So, you know, I've always been somebody who believes, again, this notion of our country being a country of freedom and tolerance. And my sense is the party is and should be accommodating to those of different viewpoints. We should all be allowed to have our viewpoint on social issues and you name them. And I also think we ought to have tolerance both ways. You know, there's a lot in the mainstream media that accuses Republicans of being intolerant, when frankly I see intolerance not only on the right but on the left. You know, because there are so many committed, passionate people who are on both sides of the abortion question. You know, and why should a pro-life Republican be maligned necessarily for his or her position? They should be afforded the ability to have that position. And I think it goes for any issue, on social issues, on international issues, domestic issues. It is about tolerance. It's about openness. It's about the country that we are. And I do think a Republican candidate that wins is going to have to be able to be a leader that can communicate that message of tolerance while maintaining you know, his conviction on the issues. It doesn't mean you can't have and maintain your position.
Sir, I promise to recognize you next. Thank you.
Hey there, thanks for coming again. My name's Carl. I'm from Marshall, Virginia, and I'm a third-year undergraduate in Batten. And so my question is, what advice would you give to someone our age who wanted to become the House Majority Leader?
I could be
And what to do when you get there.
Right, I could give you a cynical quip back, but I'm not. You know, first of all, I mean, get involved, and it's so easy today to get involved. I mean, I know every one of you has, you know, a friends list on Facebook and other outlets that allow you to communicate instantaneously. And notice what's going on around you in the community here in Charlottesville or when you graduate and wherever you go, and just circulate and get involved. I mean, if you're interested in getting involved in the electoral process and becoming an elected official, obviously the easiest routes are to choose which side you're on and access the local Republican or Democratic committee. Here in the city of Charlottesville, if you live in Albemarle County, County of Albemarle, or wherever you are. And there are plenty of individuals. If you show up at those meetings, they will grab a hold of you and then some. I can tell you I will, leaving here, just because, you know, there's a lot that we're trying to do in the Republican Party in Virginia to start winning elections again. I mean, you know, for those of you who are Republican, I mean, I'm very dismayed by the fact that my party hasn't won a statewide election since 2009. So almost 7 years. And so that to me has to change, but it comes, the secret to me comes through involvement by people in your generation. You're the future. So get involved and get involved in the issues, get others involved, and you will experience sort of that process and begin to understand how it's done. Get involved with campaigns, and obviously once you get there, to understand, and this understanding you're gaining, and from when I saw what's going on here in the virtual and the game, I don't know what the
Simulation Center.
Simulation Center, unbelievable. I mean, you'll have some context of how to act and react once you're there. So if you are interested in the arena, certainly expose yourself through internships, whatever, to try and gain as much exposure as you possibly can to understand the process, and you're getting huge amounts of that here at Batten, which is wonderful. But just, you can't sit still, you know, time is ticking every day. So I like the commitment and the passion. It's wonderful.
One of the jobs of a moderator is know when to declare success. I just think that's a wonderful benediction for our general discussion. I'd like to invite each of you to greet our guests individually, and then we're going to have a press availability. But I can't resist, at the risk of invoking Mr. Jefferson's name one more time, just underscoring what our guest has just said. And I say this to you guys in class, I'm just going to say it to you again. The concept of this university was to train the magistrates for the young nation. And it's amazing that 200 years later, that concept is embodied by you guys out grabbing a slice of pizza and listening to the majority leader. But that's why all of us are here. It's why Mr. Cantor took time out of his day. It's why I left a lucrative deal up in DC. Thank God I did. I'm so glad I'm not up there. But it's what your day is about. It's the opportunity to get involved and to accept that responsibility, not just to be an analyst or be an armchair critic, but to be involved in shaping the decisions in the future. And some of this stuff we talk about in class, we'll be grandparents, and we'll be saying, good luck with that, let me know how that works out. But you'll be right in the middle of it. So I want you to appreciate how unique it is to hear someone who's been so involved in that arena. And please join me in thanking not just a national thought leader, but a Batten parent for taking his time to be with us today. Thank you again so much.